Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 8 cheat sheet, and this is an interesting week, obviously, because there are so many people wildcarding. So it's worth looking at the cheat sheet just from a medium to long-term perspective, but still, there are some punts in play here for people who are actually planning just for the short term. I know some people are, for example, planning for Game Week 9 wildcards or even Game Week 10 wildcards, and there have been a lot of injuries this week as well. I think just to get started with the injuries, I've heard about a Saka injury, an Eze injury. Saka seems like he could be back for the City game, but Estupinian's out for a month. Diaby could miss out the game as well. So a lot of news to actually listen to in terms of press conferences. But let's get started with the midfield position. As far as the budget players, I think that Neto is a very serious consideration right now. Ultimately, you're looking at a player who actually plays 90 minutes per game, which is something that we want in FPL players, particularly from players in weaker teams, because the reality is they get much less chances, right, compared to, let's say, a top flight player in a top flight team. And actually, the only thing really holding Neto back is the strength of his team. I would say when you look at Wolves, for example, look at their expected goals, it's not too high. And Neto is actually someone who has higher expected assists because he's more of a creative winger. And so he's also relying on his teammates to finish, which is part of his value. And Hwang so far has done quite well. So it really depends on whether Neto can actually continue to improve in terms of his underlying stats because he's a very good pick. On the other hand, I think Gordon is still fantastic. And I'm actually strongly considering wildcarding with Gordon and sort of creating a team structure, keeping Gordon in mind, right? So all you really need to do, for example, if you're wildcarding, is to 4-4-2 for 1 week, and then actually Gordon can be back in your team playing permanently. So far, he's done amazing. Now, keep in mind, of course, historically, it's not like his underlying stats have been amazing, but he also has very small sample size. So as a young kid, as someone playing in a very, very strong Newcastle team, getting very, very good minutes, I think the expectations for Gordon can be extremely high. And that's why I'm quite confident in him as a pick. As far as players like Douglas Luiz and Gibbs White, Douglas Luiz is purely because Aston Villa's fixture schedule is good and he's a penalty taker, but there is absolutely no value to him in open play whatsoever. He is more someone that you can consider if you're completely pressed from a price perspective, right? If you can't even afford, let's say, Neto or Gordon. As far as Gibbs White, he's a bit more expensive than all of them. And actually, for the first time, we saw him benched. Now, he was benched in part due to tactical reasons, but also in part due to sort of load management. But that's something you don't really want to see. Ultimately, Nottingham Forest are playing, at best 2 games a week, but realistically, they're one of the few teams in the league that actually gets to enjoy playing 1 game a week. And the fact that he can't manage the load, obviously because he played in the U21 tournament and played all the games there, just already shows that there are going to be times where Gibbs White could be rotated, not only rotated, but also not playing the 90 minutes like someone like Neto. The one thing that we do know is that he is on penalties, but we're not sure of that as well because there are some potential other penalty takers in this team. Someone like Awani as well could be on penalties. In terms of players within the 6.0 to 6.9 position, I think Diaby is quite clearly the best pick going forwards, but of course there is an asterisk over Diaby as well. We know that he's not fit for this midweek fixture and he hasn't been in training this week. So I think that you could even treat him someone like Gordon, for example, where you bench him for 1 week. It doesn't feel so good to spend that much money on a player that eventually is going to be benched. But he's an interesting pick, right? Because we know that the fixtures are getting better and better. And when you look at Game Week 10, that's another avenue where you'd probably be considering Diaby as a transfer in, particularly if, let's say, you want to give Mbeumo the benefit of the doubt and actually play him towards that Burnley fixture. And that's also why I feel like I've not dropped Mbeumo too much, but I have given him 1 drop. Yes, of course, Mbeumo hasn't been that scintillating the last 2-3 games, but you also have to keep in mind one of the games was Newcastle and 2 of the games were pretty poor, yes, but Mbeumo was still a penalty taker. When you look at and review, for example, the Nottingham Forest game, you can see that he deserved a penalty, and in some instances, being a penalty taker is very, very advantageous. And so far, even though he's not taken penalties in the last 3 matches, his expected goal involvement has still been okay. It's obviously been quite mediocre for his sort of opening standards, but we shouldn't expect too much from Mbeumo. And I think also the great expectations for Mbeumo have sort of been matched with also, recent poor underperformances. But if we also look at some other players within his price bracket, I mean, they're also guilty and capable of blanks and poor games. So I think Mbeumo, yes, of course, it's tough when you're watching, let's say, Mbeumo playing on the touchline effectively as a right wing back, but hopefully that will change. And of course, he does have value in the team, and he is a 90-minute player. Richarlison, for me, has been added to the cheat sheet because he's a great punt for these 2 weeks. One thing that concerns me, of course, is that he probably will be called up by the Brazilian national team, which would mean that he won't be able to play Game Week 9, or likely, just like we saw the previous time, that he'd probably be rested and maybe come off the bench. That's obviously not particularly good. But the one thing that's nice for Richarlison for the time being is we know that Manor Solomon is actually injured, and also Brennan Johnson is obviously, or has been, dealing with an injury himself, which also has precluded him from being called up from the Wales national team. So that's quite nice for Richarlison punt. You're looking at very, very good minutes for Game Week 8, and there is a bit of a doubt in Game Week 9, but I think what's interesting in Game Week 9 is that there are a lot of good transfer outs as well. So for example, if you are going for this sort of opening wildcard punt with Richarlison, you plan to transfer him out, you could think about something cute like that, but I also think you have to think about squad value and also the shape of your squad. If you want to keep triple Spurs going forwards, it's actually very hard to envision keeping Richarlison in your team as well. So that's something that's quite tough that you have to think about. As far as players like Ward-Prowse and Mitoma, no real changes there. In my opinion, both these two players have bad fixtures on Game Weeks 8 and 9, and they're going to be serious considerations in Game Week 10, but I'm not going to say that they're picks that you should absolutely jump into. You could obviously think about, let's say, wildcarding into one of these players, hoping that they do okay within these semi to bad fixtures, but I would say it still makes sense to actually envision them as transfers in the future, but not now. As far as 7.0 to 7.9 players, Maddison obviously reigns supreme. I don't think there are too many picks that really compare to Maddison at this level because Luis Diaz unfortunately doesn't have the minutes. Yes, of course, with suspensions like Jota, like Akpo being injured, and even, for example, Curtis Jones actually getting another red card himself, that, of course, means it's quite easy for Luis Diaz to get minutes for Game Week 8, but then I would be concerned about the fixtures going forward, so that's quite tough. As far as someone like Szoboszlai, you're looking at a player here who obviously rises. I think the one thing that takes away from Szoboszlai is, yes, the underlying stats in previous years were fantastic, as well as the goal output, but he is clearly playing a very defined role within this Liverpool team. And I don't have the confidence to say, for example, Liverpool will change the team structure to play him in a more advanced manner. So I think he's interesting just because Liverpool have good fixtures, and he's a nice punt because obviously great in terms of long shot taking, and also is on set some new added set piece duties as well for this Liverpool team. But that could also, for example, take away from Trent, and maybe they share them as well. So I don't think he's a perfect pick, but I think in terms of the fixtures point of view, he's quite interesting. As far as Bowen, as I said, similar to James Ward-Prowse in the previous week, you still got, two bad fixtures in hand, and then actually you're still looking at very, very good fixtures from Game Weeks 10 onwards, and that's probably the time when I'd be seriously considering Bowen. Foden and Sterling unfortunately both fall. It's a case where they've got, Foden himself actually already is on a bad fixture run, and Sterling has pretty much one game left before the bad fixture run starts. So yes, of course, whilst you can treat someone like Sterling, for example, as a punt in this game week, I just think that there are too many options right now to think about where you probably wouldn't seriously consider Sterling within your team. As far as the Knicks bracket here, 8.0 effectively to Son. Son obviously is probably the priority pick in a wild card, and he's probably also a priority transfer within this bracket. Outside of that, though, I think due to the Saka injury and also just the concern overall with his overall fitness and the bad fixture, Saka does fall. There aren't really many reasons for Saka to fall other than the fact that he's got two effectively bad games in hand. We know that this Chelsea team is actually quite a competent defense. Yes, of course, Arsenal games and these sort of derbies are actually quite high scoring, but you can't expect too much, I think, from these games. And obviously, Saka and Odegaard are probably future transfers in from people who actually own, let's say, Son and Maddison. That pair, and both pairs actually are very, very similar in price. So when you're thinking about, let's say, even keeping Fernandes and Rashford, I think the plan to, let's say, move towards two Arsenal midfielders in Game Week 10 is definitely on a lot of people's and their radars. So when you look at, let's say, Game Week 10 versus Sheffield United, yes, of course, Game Week 11 is followed by a pretty poor fixture versus Newcastle away. But overall, you'd probably have more confidence within this Arsenal team, and specifically within Saka and Odegaard, both who have a penalty share within the team, unless you also want to assort a little bit of penalty share to Kai Havertz. I think going forwards, obviously, seriously, when we're talking about them, Saka and Odegaard are the players to look at here. Salah, obviously, still a king, and fixtures are there. And that's why Salah, of course, has been, for example, a prime option in the last few weeks. And arguably, he's overperformed and Haaland has underperformed, which is why we're in a landscape now where people are actually considering Haaland-less drafts. It seems like it's actually, we're trying to fit Haaland into a Salah team right now. So it does show you the change of the landscape in FPL and how fast things move. In terms of the forward position, though, I don't think there are too many changes here. To be honest, I don't really want to talk too much about the forward position. I do think when you're looking at players like João Pedro and Ferguson, just to touch on them very quickly, it's not really interesting to go into them. They have two bad fixtures, and then maybe after that, you're still dealing with a lot of rotation. So players like Ferguson and João Pedro can be playing 45 minutes a game, 30 minutes a game, or 60 minutes a game. And it's not really a landscape where I really want to dip into a Brighton attacker. I still think Mitoma is the one. But obviously they're super cheap as well. So you might be able to, for example, time, let's say, a hat trick or a brace, but it's very hard to justify that. What you have in someone like Solanke who gets a rise is 3 good fixtures in a row. And sometimes that's all you need really to jump onto an asset who's actually relatively cheap, right? Because when you compare it to some of the midfield picks, we're actually lacking options in that sort of 6.0 to 6.9 price bracket. So it's very tough to say, oh, I want to go into Diaby he's not even fit for Game Week 8, or, oh, I want to continue owning Mbumo because it's been hard to own him. So I do think Solanke's quite an interesting option. Awoniyi has less minutes, but he's obviously a good pick. I would say that because he's not on penalties, that's also a difference to why Solanke, in my opinion, is sort of the preferred option. We might see Awoniyi on penalties in the future, and that would obviously strengthen his validity as a pick. But for now, because I don't know that he's on penalties, and I don't think he is, he's going to stay, for example, in this tier, and Weiss obviously remaining there as well. As far as Alvarez and Højlund, I've been very confident about these picks. In the previous weeks, nice to see Alvarez score a free kick as well. That is the advantage of being a set piece taker, which obviously we would not have expected for Alvarez before KDB's injury. And now that's obviously a huge sort of tool to his game, because even though the expected goal involvement is not that crazy for Alvarez, you need to factor in that set pieces actually sort of inflate how good your potential goal and assist output could be, right? Because you're getting a lot of assists and even a lot of goals from very, very small XG creating opportunities. As far as Højlund, I think he's going to get more minutes and more minutes. And we talked about, him recovering from his back injury, and he looks fantastic, right? Scored 2 goals for Galatasaray, but obviously United still in absolute tatters, losing 3-2 in that game, as I said. So it is a bit of a concern with Højlund, but I think obviously he's a young, talented player with good fixtures. So if you're already invested into Højlund, I definitely would not move away from him. Yes, of course, it's very easy to get blinded by how well Watkins did last week, and we gave Watkins a rise last week ahead of that Brighton fixture. But I did not expect, for example, 23 points. But this is the landscape of FPL as well, where you see, for example, someone like Wilson drops because of the injury news. And a lot of people are getting struck by these really random injuries that we wouldn't have been able to call ahead of time. Players and managers, for example, like Eddie Howe and Arteta, are not giving us the full information for us to actually make the best moves possible. And sometimes you have to sort of just rely instead, I suppose, on players who maybe have a cleaner or fitter injury record. But it's very hard to sort of get into those details because we've seen some injuries to players as well who've been very fit for most of their careers as well this season. As far as Darwin, I think the concern here is that Gakpo seems to be actually ready to come back to this team after the international break. So that clearly means that Darwin's not so interesting as an option, because we also know he's coming back from South America. Those international fixtures probably mean that Darwin could actually get a rest, which is what we saw last time around. So that's a bit of a concern from owning Darwin. And I don't think, let's say, justifying that he's going to get a full start versus Brighton, which is going to be the toughest fixture in this fixture run, is a justified way to say that Darwin's a very good pick right now. Now, if Gakpo was out for longer, or Jota was suspended for longer, then it could be interesting. But for now, I still probably wouldn't touch Darwin for the time being. Jesus is an interesting one where I just think Arsenal, not really considering for the next 2 fixtures, and maybe after that, then Jesus can be a very, very good pick to actually go around. And it's nice, obviously, if you move into Watkins now, you can reconsider after, let's say, that Luton at home fixture that Watkins has, and then actually reconsider whether you want to move into some other assets. As far as someone like Haaland, he's still a top option, but as I was saying, it seems like the landscape is a little bit more geared towards Salah, because more of the captaincies over the next 4 to 6 weeks will actually probably be placed on either Salah or Son, as opposed to Haaland, where I think, yes, of course, there are 2 good fixtures on the calendar so far. You're looking at the Brighton fixture on the calendar, and you're also looking at the Bournemouth fixture on the calendar as captaincy opportunities. But outside of that, there are probably good justifications to say that you can go out of Haaland. Now, if United continue to play so poorly on defense, that might not even be a question for that fixture too. But as we saw last season, and as I experienced myself, obviously that triple captaincy versus United was a little bit of wishful thinking as well. He is not fixture proof, and ultimately, as I always say, great picks will always do better in easier fixtures. And sometimes you'll have 1-game samples that suggest that that's not the case, like, for example, Sun versus Sheffield, and then Sun versus Arsenal as well, conversely. But over the course of time, we've seen that that's the case. I mean, look at Sun's historic record versus weaker teams that also employ low blocks. In terms of defense as well this week, just moving on over there, I don't think there's too much that has changed, right? I've added and sort of rejigged the budget players. Taylor and Lamptey are in. Lamptey is tough because I think he's only going to get 1 good fixture due to the Estupiñán sort of injury and recovery timeline, right? So you're probably only going to get 1 good fixture from Lamptey, which is going to be game week 10. And then actually Estupiñán is probably set to come back by game week 11, which makes Lamptey not really viable as a pick. On the other hand, Taylor is coming from this Burnley team where he seems like he's nailed again. And that's very, very good, because Burnley probably are, I would say, the team within all the relegated sides, or all those, promoted sides that actually are the best. But it's very, I don't mean that too much, right? Because the expectations unfortunately for Sheffield United and Luton are very, very low. So saying that Burnley is better isn't really much of a compliment. So Taylor is here just because he's a playing player at 3.9, who's probably a little bit more value than some of the other players and the teams that I mentioned. At 4.5 to 4.9, you are looking at some picks here that are fantastic, and that's why there's a huge laundry list of players. I think with Gabriel Zinchenko, just to single them out, there is a potential that with Partey coming back now that we could see them rotated, right? We've seen a lot of Zinchenko early substitutions. We may even see, for example, a little bit more of Kiwior and Tomiyasu coming in. So I'm a little bit concerned of them, but I think right now Arteta will sort of persist with this backline of Gabriel and Zinchenko. Now, as soon as that becomes wrong, I think obviously they have to drop, but I'm pretty confident that they will continue to play going forwards. Obviously, you might have a bit more confidence in the other picks, right? Because you've got players like Burn and even Botman, who seems like he could be for Game Week 8, apparently. Could be a rush, but I think obviously he's definitely back after Game Week 8, and he'll be back for the good fixture in Game Week 9, which is very nice. Crystal Palace at home. Burn obviously has gotten a rise for the same reason that we are very, very keen on this Newcastle defense. As far as players like Cash, Udogis, and even, for example, Dalot. These are players who actually have very, very good fixtures over the next 5 game weeks, right? When you look at someone like Udogi, you're looking at 2 fantastic fixtures back to back. When you're looking at Cash, it's effectively just a green run of fixtures. And with Dalot, obviously, yes, of course, United have been absolutely terrible, but he is a fullback at the end of the day. And you're also just looking at a player who really just has prime fixtures. He's got Luton, he's got Sheffield United, and he's got Fulham. Yes, of course, whilst United are terrible, they are still versus some teams that really struggle to score. And that's probably why I would favor, for example, Dalot as a pick going forwards. And it's just a case of fixtures, right, in FPL. That's why Fernandes, for example, still is a top pick for me, even though very likely he's not going to perform as much as we really would have initially thought he would at the start of the season. And in terms of Pau, obviously a new option, just because Cash has risen so much in price, you're now looking at alternative options, and obviously Pau will be one of them for this Aston Villa team. And in terms of Colwill, why he's fantastic is because he can be a very cute sort of pick that you can go for on the wild card, where if let's say you're actually going for Gordon, I think going Colwill in your team, playing a 4-4-2 could be very interesting, because even though Colwill doesn't have good fixtures until game week 15, this wildcard is supposed to last you until game week 20 and beyond. So you need a player who's going to be playing games. He's a nailed player. This Chelsea team's a very good defense. You may even play them in game week 10. And so Colwill actually has quite a lot of value that I think is underrated, even though, I mean, I don't think he's underrated because obviously he got an assist and then triple bonus points in the previous game week, but you're actually looking at him being a very, very valid pick, just because he sort of covers in some key fixtures that are poor, right? Because even this fixture, you could argue, is a poor fixture from a Newcastle owning point of view. Yes, of course, you'd probably play Trippier over Colwill, but you probably don't want to play Burn versus West Ham away because the value there and the attacking upside isn't there. Whereas obviously when Colwill gets to play versus Burnley, it's quite an interesting opportunity for a clean sheet as someone who's also playing the left back position. As far as the Gerd, interesting pick. Not the most serious of picks, but obviously going to be good game week 10 onwards. Just a center back as well. Probably less value than Colwill, if we're being honest, in terms of ability to actually create an open play, which is what Colwill did to actually earn his assist. In the 5.0 plus position, you're looking at players like Porro getting a rise for the same reason that Udogi gets a rise. I think obviously I was late in terms of Porro because I couldn't guess the minutes. I've not seen Porro play under Angie before, and now we've actually had multiple game weeks, effectively 6 in a row, where he's only been subbed off for 1 to 2 minutes, and I have a lot of confidence now in his minutes because he's also playing incredibly well. He's also actually defending a lot better than I've ever seen him defend, which is a bit of a shock to me, obviously, as a Spaniard who saw him stink it up once in international duty. And I have a lot of confidence in Porro just because the underlying stats are honestly that much better than Udogi, who's actually only gotten 3 assists, and Porro has not delivered. So if you're actually, let's say, betting in the future on one of these picks, I'd actually bet on Porro to do better. Saliba also gets a rise. I think I dropped him a little bit too far. Ultimately, he is an absolutely nailed Arsenal defender. I probably wouldn't consider Saliba just because price is a little bit out of order. But Estupiñán as well, unfortunately, gets a fall just due to the fact that he's injured. And obviously, Estupiñán has been taken out of the cheat sheet. As far as Trippier, Robertson, Alexander-Arnold, it's just a case where Trippier is still fantastic, but Robertson and Trent actually have good fixtures finally, and they can be serious picks. And Trent is unfortunately not a serious pick if you go for a Salah Haaland draft, but if you go Haaland less, I do think Trent should firmly be within your radar. And as far as the goalkeepers this week, not too many changes. I've added John Stone as a rise because obviously the Henderson injury means that he's going to get more minutes going forwards. As far as Raya, you're looking at a player who I think, in my opinion, is worth punting on from a wildcard point of view, just because you'll have Areola as a great backup, and punting that Ramsdale won't find his way back into the team because Raya has a lot of qualities there. Yes, of course, he made a mistake versus Lens, but every keeper makes mistakes. It's all about just the overall average quality, and I think Raya probably will continue to sort of displace Ramsdale for the time being, but I might be wrong on that as well. So there is a risk attached to that, which is why there's an asterisk. I just say that if you're wildcarding, it could be an interesting punt. As far as Onana, look, I mean, he's dropped, but he's actually a good pick. And this is the reality. United have good fixtures. If you own Onana, I would probably not sell him. If you are wildcarding, I probably would not look at him, just out of sheer fear of how much worse, I guess, each United performance can get week to week. But that's the reality. Fleck and Ederson obviously have a blank game week in the future, so they are unfortunately differentials. And Alisson gets a rise as well, just simply because, look, the performances have been outstanding. He is one of the greatest shot stoppers in the world as well. And you'd think he doesn't need to in this Liverpool team, but considering they play with 10 men so often, it seems like he does. And he gets a lot of value from that, as well as also just being very, very good in terms of passing, and also routes to bonus points through that as well. So that's going to be the cheat sheet for this week. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I will see you guys in the next video.